Welcome to Florence, the cradle of the Renaissance. But before it became the capital of artistic rebirth, it was the forge of modern finance. Our focus today is not on marble or masterpieces, but on the true source of its power and the instrument of its eventual tyranny, public debt. By the 15th century, the Florentine system of state indebtedness would solidify the power of a nascent financial elite, culminating in the rise of the Medici family, who demonstrated how bankers, when placed at the head of government, could fundamentally prefer public debt over issuing new currency. To understand this revolutionary financial shift, we must first recognize the fundamental constraints facing Florence and its rival city-states during the medieval period. Throughout the Middle Ages, the circulation of money in Europe faced severe limitations. Since Roman times, Europe had experienced a continuous flight of precious metals toward the Orient. Compounding this historical outflow was a scarcity of new mineral discoveries, save for small quantities under Charlemagne. This scarcity led to a systemic monetary rarefaction of gold and, critically, of silver, a metal heavily utilized for European commerce. This monetary scarcity continued until the discovery of the Americas and the start of the Renaissance, when precious metals began flowing back into Europe abundantly. However, Italy was largely excluded from this new inflow, having not participated significantly in the conquest of the world. This systemic rarity of metal made the coining of new currency rare. Consequently, states were forced to turn to taxation and indebtedness to maintain the circulation of the money that already existed. Furthermore, the very act of minting currency was politically constrained. City-states like Florence needed authorization from the Holy Roman Emperor to mint coins. For instance, Genoa only received this authorization in 1139, following its participation in the Crusades, an event that was certainly not accidental in this context. These constraints meant that relying on new coinage was both technically limited by metallic supply and politically dependent on external imperial authority. Therefore, when funding was required, especially given the multitude of wars between the small Italian states, the political class faced a choice: attempt to mint limited, politically constrained coins, or resort to debt and increased taxation. This choice dramatically increased the need for money and fueled the recourse to indebtedness. The resulting debt, often recorded with interests on ledger books, led to the creation of a powerful link between political power and finance. This financial alliance also incorporated a segment of the wealthy population, generally represented by the merchants. In this environment of scarcity and external restriction, the practice of creating credit through accounting entries, a surrogate of money, flourished in Italy, especially in the fair trade system, and was later formalized by bankers to create what is now known as fractional reserve banking. This backdrop sets the stage for Florence, which provides a crucial example of how the financial elites, personified by the Medici, consciously chose the path of public debt over the power of new coinage, securing their own wealth and control. Florence's economic strength and subsequent regional dominance between the 12th and 14th centuries were rooted in geography and economics. The constant population growth into the 1300s led to the expansion of the city and a significant change in land ownership. Wealth became deeply concentrated in the hands of a few, establishing Florence's economic hegemony over Tuscany, pulling resources from the countryside into the urban market. To finance its expansionist policies, particularly those leading up to the conclusion of the first phase of state construction with the conquest of Pisa in 1406, Florence relied on a complex fiscal system that ultimately guaranteed its public debt. Taxation and estimation, funding the debt. Initially, Florence maintained distinct tax systems for the contado, the extra-urban area, and the distretto, the recently conquered provinces. The contado alone contained over 1,100 medium, small, and tiny communities unified under a single fiscal system. A critical feature of this early system was the estimo. This technical advancement replaced earlier fixed feudal taxation methods. The estimo did not record the real value of assets or income, but rather a family's declared capacity to pay. City versus country, Florentine city residents were often exempted from direct taxes based on the estimo. The direct taxes, based on these estimations, were reserved for the communities of the contado. City taxes, city residents were still subject to indirect taxes and, crucially, the prestands, the forced loans. Between 1350 and 1415, the estimo was revised 8 times in the Florentine contado. A total comprehensive assessment, ruota dell'estimo, was officially established by law and then distributed among the various communities, which subsequently divided it among their resident families. The introduction of the catasto and decima. In 1427, a significant fiscal reform occurred with the introduction of the catasto in Florence, replacing the estimo. The purpose of this change was to make the payment of taxes more efficient. By May 1428, the catasto law was extended to the entire district. The catasto required the registration of capital value and declared income at a rate of 7%. This included land territorial income, cash and urban rents from property, movable goods and credits debts. The difference between assets and liabilities, known as sostands or sovrabondant, was also taxed. Notably, the house of residence was excluded from this valuation. Later, the catasto was simplified and replaced by the decima. This was an annual tax of 10% applied to income derived from immovable assets owned by both citizens and peasants. It was introduced in 1495, though its extension to the countryside only occurred much later, 1507 to 1508. Despite these changes, the system of prestanza, forced loans, remained widely utilized until the 17th century. The nature of prestands, forced loans. Prestands were the primary mechanism for debt creation. Initially, they were considered a duty, an obligation and a sign of belonging to the urban community, often associated with ideas of charity and civic loyalty to the Republic. Foreigners were initially prohibited from subscribing to them. However, these forced loans quickly transformed, especially in Florence where the connection between banking and politics was most evident, into financial instruments for personal enrichment. These loans, based clearly on the financial capacity of each family, were initially viewed by the wealthy as a sort of privilege because they often secured favors in return. Part 3: The consolidation of public debt and financial engineering. Visual, graphic showing the exponential growth of Florentine debt, 1390 to 1432, and the Monte Commune. The consolidation of Florentine public debt began around 1340 and was primarily used to sustain the city's expansionist policies. The central institution managing this debt was the Monte Commune. The scale of Florentine indebtedness appears to have been greater than that of Venice. The debt became enormous. 1390, Florentines were required to lend about 272,000 ducats annually. 1424 to 1432, the average annual loan rose dramatically to about 550,000 ducats. During the first 3 decades of the 15th century, prestands often equaled the state's annual income. While this provided Florence with notable financial capacity, it resulted in the highest levels of tax pressure recorded in Florentine history between 1420 and 1430. Interest rates and usury evasion. The Monte Commune guaranteed its debt using fiscal revenues. Initial interest payments, paid until 1345, were around 10%. A reform subsequently fixed the nominal interest rate at 5%. However, the government frequently surpassed this maximum nominal rate. To attract capital and simultaneously avoid censorship against usury, Florence often conceded a nominal credit on the Monte's ledger books that was higher than the actual amount paid by the lender. This practice allowed the effective interest rate to fluctuate between 10% and 15%. This occurred notably in 1358, 1362, and 1369, episodes clearly favoring the affluent citizens. Despite the fixed 5% nominal rate offered by the state, the private credit market offered much higher returns. In the first half of the 15th century, the Florentine Bank of the Bancae, for example, lent to private individuals at rates between 8% and 14%. Even credit operations linked to the Monte Commune yielded returns, albeit lower, with the Monte's credits yielding about 3% in the 15th century. Financial innovations, Monte del Dote and Monte di Pietà. The increasing debt made it difficult for the government to pay interest to creditors, triggering a financial crisis. This crisis necessitated the creation of new instruments, such as the Monte del Dote Dowry Fund. Monte del Dote, 1425, founded primarily to meet the government's financial needs, this fund also served as an investment vehicle for marriage dowries. Florentines deposited capital, which was then repaid with interest upon the daughter's marriage. Initially unsuccessful due to financial instability, it later thrived when the compounded interest rate reached a high of 17.4%. Deposits were often subscribed using the existing obligations of the Monte Commune, which formally helped reduce the public debt. Although the majority of investors were highly affluent, artisans and workers also made deposits to secure dowries for their daughters. Monte di Pietà, 1496. This institution was originally founded as a charity to provide loans to the poor against pawns. It quickly evolved, however, into a deposit bank and a powerful financial instrument. The Medici dukes utilized it to drain liquid capital for themselves and their associates. Debts incurred by the government on the open market were often guaranteed by fiscal revenues and by the funds of the Monte di Pietà. Part 4: The Oligarchy of Debt and the Medici Ascendancy. Visual transition from Republican symbols to the Medici coat of arms, depiction of bankers discussing loans. In Florence, though the debt was institutionally administered by a governmental agency, the Monte, the government itself was managed by the bankers. The Medici family structured the management of debt to specifically favor the financial elites. Florence, unlike Venice or Genoa, which remained republics until their independence ended, eventually saw the Medici successfully establish a Grand Duchy starting in 1569. The evolution of debt was a key factor in their success. Debt as a tool for political control. From the mid-15th century onward, state financing under Medici rule increasingly relied on short-term debt. This reliance strengthened the Medici's clientelary network, re-clientela. The Medici government initially preferred a floating debt system. This allowed the Medici to maintain a broad clientelary network through the concession of favors. Subsequently, through the use of short-term loans, the Medici allowed a relatively restricted group to exploit massive revenues from state borrowing. This mechanism worked as follows. This select group would gather money from Tuscan bankers at an interest rate of 8%. They would then lend this same money to the commune, the government, at 12%. This system was highly uneconomical for the government. By allowing this structure, the Medici, acting as politicians and bankers, created powerful ties with a small, dependent financial group. Fundamentally, under the Medici, the state's indebtedness was often neglected by the ruling class regarding its weight on the government's coffers. Instead, private interests were upheld at the expense of public finance. The Medici regime effectively bound an oligarchy to itself, an oligarchy that profited immensely from the management of public debt. Even major military campaigns, such as the war against Siena in 1555, were financed by Grand Duke Cosimo using short-term loans provided by foreign bankers. Concentration of wealth. The praestands, initially viewed as a civic duty, rapidly became concentrated in the hands of the richest families, reinforcing the financial elite's power. Early concentration. By 1427, the wealthiest Florentine families were responsible for almost all the forced loans. This meant that the financial activity of state debt concerned only a small portion of the population. 1427 data. The Catasto of 1427 indicated that 60% of the state's bonds were held by only 2% of the population. Growing monopoly. The concentration grew over time, potentially due to the loss of market value of the obligations, making them less attractive to the general populace. For example, in the Santo Spirito quarter between 1427 and 1458, the number of families holding state bonds decreased from 157 to 136, showing a clear trend toward concentration in fewer hands. Reliance on debt income. The state creditors frequently derived approximately 1/5 of their total income from government bonds. Part 5. Speculation, crisis, and the burden on the working class. Visual, a depiction of the Siompi Revolt, animated ledger books showing interest payments flowing out of the state. The public debt system did not just concentrate wealth, it institutionalized a system where the wealthy could profit from the state's difficulties, often at the expense of the working population. Funding the interest payments. The money used to pay interest to the rich creditors came predominantly from taxes on commerce and consumption. In effect, the working classes, grass base, paid the interest to the creditors through taxes levied on what they bought and used. The Siompi Revolt, 1378. The high effective interest rates, sometimes 10% to 15%, conceded to the wealthy citizens eventually provoked popular unrest. The most famous of these uprisings was the revolt of the Siompi in 1378. The Siompi, who were wool workers, accused the creditors of obtaining excessive returns from the commune obligations. However, this revolt was suppressed within a couple of weeks. The secondary market and speculation. While initial forced loans, pre-stands, were a civic duty and often blocked from transfer, the negotiability of state debt was permitted starting in 1344. This allowed for a complex and active market for Florentine state securities. Market size. By 1365, roughly 1,000 residents out of a total population of 30,000 in 2 Florentine quarters held or traded at least 100 nominal florins of the Monte Commune. By 1458, about 2% of the nominal debt was traded by private citizens annually, rising later to 5%. Speculative cycles. During financial crises, when citizens lacked liquidity, they would sell their state credits to obtain cash. This depressed the value of the titles. At these moments, speculators could acquire the titles at low prices to profit later. These speculations were highly dependent on the government's future capacity to honor its payments. Given that the Medici, as bankers, were the city's principal financiers, they held intimate knowledge regarding the state's payment capacity, giving them immense power over the market. The Medici later supported foreign demand for these securities, especially from the 15th century onward. In the early 15th century, about 1/10 of the Florentine debt was held by foreigners, indicating that despite the debt being local, the market was open to foreign bankers. The debate on legality and usury. During the late Middle Ages, there was a lively debate regarding the legitimacy of interest payments on government loans. The main concern was focused on speculations in the secondary market, rather than the interest rates on the primary forced loans. A complex theoretical apparatus was constructed to justify this profit. Advocates, such as the lawyer Lorenzo Ridolfi, were resolute in their approach to justifying speculation. Conversely, the scholastics condemned such practices as illicit, suggesting investment in commerce instead. Despite the scholastics' moral opposition, the reality of the credit market was highly lucrative. In certain cases, credit profits for the Banchi family reached more than 60%, contrasting sharply with the average of 10 to 12% seen in the rest of Italy during the 13th and 15th centuries. Even the returns on the secondary market for state credits were significantly more attractive than long-term private credit or commercial ventures. The creation of the clientelary network by the Medici, combined with the active secondary debt market, formed a system highly similar to the modern financial structure, featuring primary creditors who actively speculated on state debts. The regime deliberately used debt management to cement its political foundation. The Florentine state's indebtedness was not merely an economic necessity but a strategic political choice. By neglecting the burden of debt on public finances and supporting private enrichment, the Medici regime succeeded in binding an oligarchy to itself. The evolution of monetary and fiscal systems in Florence provided the rich with an effective surrogate for cash in a period marked by the scarcity of precious metals. Although Florence and other Italian communes initially collected enormous sums with interests 5% to 7%, lower than those later demanded by the great European monarchies during the Renaissance, the key outcome was the structural shift in power. In essence, Florence demonstrated that when the government is managed by bankers, the Medici, the state's financial resources and policies will be geared toward maintaining private financial interests. This practice, relying on forced loans, pre-stands, and market speculation, ensured that the power struggle ended decisively in favor of the financial elite, securing their position through a system of institutionalized and perpetually profitable public debt. This model, pioneered by the bankers of Florence, laid the foundation for modern state financing, where the issuance of debt became the preferred and most profitable method of governance.